please turn with me, if you will, to the book of Genesis. We're going to be looking at Genesis 18 this morning. Every verse of it, Lord willing. We're going to look at Genesis 18, 1 through 33. If you are using the blue ESV Bible in the seat backs out there, you can find our text on page 12. And the title of the sermon is Heavenly Visitors. Are you a friend of God? Are you in friendship with God? Another way you could say it is, do you live in communion with God? John Owen describes friendship with God using that term, communion, as many others do. He says, our communion with God consists in His communication of Himself unto us, with our return unto Him of that which He requires and accepts, flowing from that union which is in Jesus Christ we have with Him. Friendships form, in some ways, whether with God or with people, when we value each other, when we care about each other, when we want to spend time together, to know and to be known by the other. And so the question, are you a friend of God? Are you in friendship with God? Is God your friend? It might seem silly or it might seem impossible. But Isaiah 41:8 calls Abraham the friend of God. James affirms this in his epistle in James 2:23. And though the word friendship doesn't occur here in Genesis 18, Genesis 18 does bear out, by way of several examples in Abraham's life here and his interactions with the Lord, what friendship with God looks like. Not how he became a friend of God, but being God's friend, what does that mean? What we see here, following on the heels of last week's chapter, where we saw God establish His covenant, the covenant of circumcision with Abraham, and we saw Abraham's obedience with it. We see God draw near to Abraham and to have a meal with him. He encourages Abraham with the promise of another son, or another promise of a son, rather, and I guess another son as well, because he already has one, Ishmael. But he reiterates the promise of a son, and he invites Abraham, astonishingly, at the end of the chapter, we see him invite Abraham into his confidence, and he shares his plans with him as to what he is going to do to the wicked city of Sodom. And he permits Abraham to haggle with him, as it were, over exactly how many righteous people would be required to warrant mercy for this wicked city. But God doesn't just befriend Abraham, because it's one thing to say that Abraham is God's friend. But Psalm 25:14 says, the friendship of the Lord is for those who fear Him, and He makes known to them His covenant. And so, as we consider Genesis 18 together this morning, I want to keep it in mind, this reality that God befriends sinners. And so when we look at Genesis 18, let's ask ourselves, well, what does that mean for us? If I am the friend of God, what do God's friends do? So let me read the passage. We'll read all 33 verses, and then we'll outline the sermon and get working on it. Beginning in verse 1, and the Lord appeared to him, Abraham, by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, Do as you have said." And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes." And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She is in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you, about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "No, but you did laugh." Then the men set out from there, and they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." Then the Lord said, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" And the Lord said, "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Abraham answered him and said, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, "I will not destroy it if I find 45 there." Again he spoke to him and said, "Suppose 40 are found there." He answered, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Then he said, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there." He answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." He said, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there." He said, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." Then he said, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there." He answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. There are 4 friendship calls that this passage offers to us that I want to consider with you this morning. First, the friends of God are hospitable. You see this in verses 1 to 8. Second, God's friends seek to have rightly ordered homes. We also see that in verses 1 to 8. Third, God's friends believe God when he speaks, 9 through 15. And fourth, God's friends wrestle with God in prayer. And so we're going to consider those 4 things, and then also at the end consider significantly what this passage teaches us about God himself. So let's look together in the first place at verses 1 to 8, where we see Abraham's example of hospitality. In verse 1, the Lord appears to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, where he had settled way back in Genesis 14. He's still living there, it seems. And as Abraham looks up on this particular day, he sees three men standing in front of him, heading his way. And if you read especially Genesis 18 and 19 together, you realize that the visitor's identity is quite plain. It seems a bit mysterious at first, but Genesis 19 begins with the two angels coming to Sodom, the two that had left on from the conversation, and the Lord is with Abraham. And so you have Abraham's visitors being the Lord himself, again, another appearance of the Lord. Essentially every chapter since 14, actually since 12, every chapter with Abraham, the Lord has appeared to him in some way, and here it's the Lord coming to him with two angels, we're told. Now, it's not explicit who Abraham thought these men were at first, at least. He calls him Lord, and you'll notice that it's spelled L-O-R-D with the O-R-D in lowercase. And so this is the word that Adonai, rather than what you see in verse 1, L-O-R-D, where the O-R-D is in capital letters, Yahweh. It's not necessarily proof, though, that by calling him Adonai rather than Yahweh, that he doesn't know who he is. It could possibly simply be a way of identifying his guest respectfully, even if he does know who he is. But it's possible at first that he does not know, but as the conversation goes on, it becomes unmistakable to Abraham who is before him. And so he seeks to welcome his guest with hospitality. Whatever Abraham's practice of hospitality had been prior to his coming to know the Lord, we mentioned back in Genesis 14 that he had been given a very clear demonstration of proper hospitality. You recall there that Abraham had come back from his chasing down the four mighty armies. He had over 300 men with him. They had chased them down, beaten them handily, and rescued his nephew Lot and others. And so as he returns, he's welcomed home with a victory covenant meal of bread and wine by Melchizedek, who we said almost certainly was the pre-incarnate Son of God. And so perhaps learning a bit from that, he sees these guests and he seeks to enact the same hospitality of the same Spirit. And hospitality was an important practice at the time anyway, but he is clearly wanting to be a blessing to his guest. And there are two components to Abraham's hospitality that I want to mark here with you. First, it's marked by eagerness, and second, it's marked by generosity. And first we see his eagerness. He sees the three approaching visitors, and what does he do? But he runs to meet them. He bows himself to the earth, and he implores them to stay with him. He offers water for washing, bread for nourishment, and a place under a tree out of the sun for rest and refreshment. The visitors accept his offer, and we're told he goes quickly to the tent. He instructs Sarah, quick, make cakes from 3 seahs of fine flour. He then, from the tent, runs to the herd. He takes a calf, tender and good, and he gives it to a young man who, surely upon Abraham's instructions, prepares it quickly. Abraham's hospitality is eager, but it's also generous. And of course, that may seem like a no-brainer. Hospitality, by its very nature, is generous, but it's important to observe. I mean, consider the bread that he instructs Sarah to make. My Bible's footnote tells me that 1 seah of it's worth, or it equates to about 7.3 liters. So he tells her to use over 21 liters of fine flour, which my wife tells me is a lot. Apparently you can make quite a bit of cakes or bread with 21 liters of flour. Now, They had many people in the house, and so it's likely that the bread is not merely for the 3 guests. He had over 300 people, perhaps, he needed to feed. But it's not just bread that he has made, but he goes and he has a calf slaughtered, and he brings curds and milk to his guests as well. And so this is a decent spread, to be sure. Abraham is, in a sense, sparing no expense. But he's not just generous with the provisions, the material that he uses, but he's generous with his time. I mean, think about it. I don't know how long it would have taken Sarah to make this bread. I have no idea how long preparing the calf would have taken, but if she's making, using 21 liters of flour to make a whole lot of bread from scratch, I don't think that's the quickest process in the world, just observing bread making in general, even today. And if someone had to kill, butcher, and prepare the animal that had been alive just moments before, that's going to take some time. And so he's generous with not just the provisions on hand, what he has, but the amount of time it takes. And then he stands by and he waits on them as they eat. And so, does the Lord expect us to raise goats in order to kill them at a moment's notice, to fulfill our hospitality responsibilities? No, I don't think so. But I do strongly want to suggest to you that we need to have the same heart as Abraham. The same heart that Abraham has here. Are we ready? Are you ready to spring into action when hospitality moments present themselves to you? Are you eager and generous to find them, even when it regards strangers? Hebrews 13:2, possibly with Genesis 18 in mind, says this: do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. It may be that Abraham at first glance did not know who these men were. Though, through his display of hospitality, the Lord was pleased to reveal himself to him. Certainly by the end of the conversation, as I said earlier, there's no question that Abraham is aware of the identity of his guest. But whether he knows who they are or not at the beginning, the Bible exhorts us to show hospitality to strangers. I just read it in Hebrews 13. The Bible exhorts us to care for the poor and needy. James 2:15. The Bible exhorts us to demonstrate hospitality to one another. 1 Peter 4:9. The Bible exhorts us to sow bountifully through purposed and cheerful giving to those who are in need. 2 Corinthians 8:6 and 7. 9, 6, and 7. But here's another text that comes to mind. Matthew 25, 31 through 46. Won't read the whole passage, but the question is asked, when did we see you hungry, Lord, and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. You know, one of our core values at Redeemer Baptist Church is radical generosity. A radical generosity ought to make us eager to welcome others into our space. So whether because we are directly, even if unknowingly, entertaining angelic beings, or because of the willful solidarity of the Lord with those who are in need, especially Christians, or because our faith is proven to be useless and dead if we fail to care for those who are in need when it is in our ability to do so, we ought to be particularly eager to bless others with hospitality, as is Abraham here. Well, not every single one of us at RBC will be as hospitable as everyone else. Some of you genuinely have a supreme gift of hospitality. But it is something that all of us are called to be in one way or another. And it doesn't require a big house or great cooking skills or even decorating skills. But we can use what we have, and we can allow Abraham, the friend of God, to be our guide. And so, a final question here on this first point: are you eager to be generous with both your stuff and your time? Well, secondly, let's consider in verses 6 through 15 here. I think earlier I said it was verses 1 to 8. It's kind of combined. Some of it's in there, some of it's here in 6 through 15. So 6 through 15, we see leadership and submission within the home. Peter, in 1 Peter 3, he holds Sarah up here as a paragon of wifely submission with these words. He says, "For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves with a gentle and quiet spirit," is what he had just said. And he goes on, "by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening." Commenters agree that by and large, that Peter has Genesis 18 in mind here, and at first glance, the reference might be a little confusing. He seems to be squeezing a lot of juice out of this text. Sarah does call Abraham Lord in verse 12, while calling him very old. And this isn't exactly like what you would call a clear demonstration of faith on Sarah's part. She's doubting the Lord here. She's laughing at his promise. Now, Sarah in chapter 18 is nowhere near as troubling as Sarah back in chapter 16, but it's not necessarily, upon first glance, what you might want to say is totally commendable. She, as her husband had just done in chapter 17, laughs in response to the promise of God. And then she lies to God about it. But Peter looks at the situation and he says, "Be like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him Lord." Talk about a glass half full kind of perspective from Peter. He finds something to commend in her, even when a lot of what's happening here isn't worthy of commendation. And that is a worthy practice for all of us, as something of an aside, is when can you find commendable things in others? But let's think for a moment about what Sarah does here and the example that she sets for wives. And I think there are two things worth noting about it. She freely follows his lead and helps him in the task. And two, she respects him even in a moment of weakness on her own part. We saw previously in chapter 16 where Sarah's impatient disregard for the Lord's timetable had led her to sin against her husband by grabbing the reins, which he was all too willing to share at the moment, as she attempted to steer their lives toward her own ends, according to her own wisdom. But here, she launches into action at Abraham's direction. 21 liters of flour to make was no especially simple task. But she goes right for it. Now, the text doesn't explicitly say what she does with his instructions, interestingly enough, but her obedient response is clearly implied. She takes up the task which she had been given. This is what Peter sees anyway. And so, the question for wives, are you following your husband's lead? Are you, in Peter's words, adorning yourselves with gentle and quiet spirits, providing your husband help in the work to which he is called? You know, following someone else's lead, submitting to someone else's leadership can be scary, especially if the leadership isn't great. Peter enjoins wives here to be like Sarah, to do good, do what God has called her to do, and not fear what is frightening. Of course, this doesn't mean, as we saw a couple of weeks ago in chapter 16, when we mentioned 1 Samuel 25, that wives must endure abuse from destructive husbands and follow them no matter where they lead. But a husband who doesn't lead well, but is heading in the right direction, is not the same thing as a husband who is leading his family into destruction, whether through aggression or passivity. And so a question for wives, are you seeking to be like Sarah and to follow his lead? But a second thing is, are you respectful as she is? Again, by way of noting improvements, this is not what we saw in Genesis 16. She was very disrespectful in Genesis 16. But even here, even in some measure of unbelief, she speaks respectfully to herself of her husband. She didn't even think anybody could hear what she said. And so for wives, the question is, do you speak respectfully of your husband? Both within your own heart and to others, including him. Again, apparently, as we touched on in Genesis 16, if you're married to a Nabal, 1 Samuel 25, there is a time and a place to acknowledge what kind of man you're married to. But you've got to be married to a Nabal to justify talking about him like that. And so, Peter enjoins from this passage wives to commit themselves to a resolve to respect their husbands in their thoughts, with their words, and with their actions, even if they're not necessarily being the most respectable they could be. He draws out this rule. Look at Sarah's free submission to Abraham's direction. Look at her respectful words about him and pattern your thinking, speaking, and conduct after her. But I said rightly ordered homes, not rightly ordered women. So husbands, how's the leadership in your home? Peter exhorts husbands to live with their wives in a gentle and understanding way, showing honor to her as the weaker vessel, remembering that she is a co-heir with you in the grace of life. So are you making your wife's task of free submission and respectful words easy, or are you making it abysmally difficult? Here in Genesis 18, Abraham's leadership is a total foil to the leadership we saw him giving in chapter 16. And his leadership here is commendable in at least three ways. It's productive, it is decisive, and it is active. Look at the differences that good leadership seems to make. In Genesis 16, Abraham seems aimless. He really doesn't make any decision himself, and he does almost nothing in the entire chapter other than allow himself to be steered into polygamy and to become an accomplice to Sarah's abuse of Hagar. But here, Abraham has a mission. He has a purpose. He knows what he's about. And so we see his productive mission. He is intent to extend hospitality to strangers, nonetheless to God himself. But he's also decisive. He sees the Lord and he begins to make decisions. He runs out to meet them. He implores them to stay. He runs back and he gives clear instructions to Sarah and the young man with the calf. But he's also active. He runs out to meet them, right? It's not just he decides to go, but he actually goes. He doesn't send someone else. And he runs back to the tent. He goes to the herd. He picks out the calf himself. He takes the food to them once it's prepared. And he waits on them. He's not aimless, without some sense of purpose. He doesn't require someone else to come up with a plan, and he doesn't sit around merely barking orders. He's an active participant in the process. So we see his commendable leadership, but there's one other thing here to note in section 9 through 15. What does the Lord do after Sarah laughs? He addresses Abraham about Sarah's laughter. Verse 13, she had laughed. The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say?" It's only when she speaks up and lies that he addresses her. Perhaps he was intent on addressing her, But it's at that point that he does actually address her. And the principle in operation here seems to be that the Lord is in some measure holding Abraham responsible for the conduct of his wife. In the end, at least because she takes this step and lies, he does speak to her, he holds her accountable, and there's a bit of a rebuke in the conversation. But we shouldn't miss this principal point that the Lord first addressed Abraham as he first addressed Adam in the garden. Eve was the one who sinned first, but it was Adam to whom he came. And so, husbands, while you are not at fault for your wife's sins, are you aware that the Lord holds you responsible for the faithfulness of your household? Sarah's laughter brings a question not to her, but first to Abraham. Her interjection of deceit earns her a swift rebuke, but the initial move that God makes is to ask Abraham about it. And so, husbands, you are responsible for setting the metaphorical thermostat, possibly the literal one as well, in your home. And you are the one that the Lord will look to first, as it were, to pay the bill. If you are aimless and directionless, you are putting a stumbling block in front of your wife who is called to follow where you lead. And if you are harsh and domineering, Peter says that you shouldn't expect God to hear your prayers. And so we shouldn't miss this responsibility that the Lord requires husbands to bear regarding the care of our families. Whether it's as severe as the goings-on of Genesis 16 or the kind of vanilla bit of laughter that we see in Genesis 18, the question for us husbands is, what is the temperature and the atmosphere in your home? And so God's friends seek to rightly order their homes. A third thing that we see here in verses 9 through 15, God's friends exercise faith in his promises. Now, admittedly, this is a bit of a negative example. What we sort of see happening here is it's the opposite of that. As we already indicated, there's something of, it's a bittersweet moment for Sarah. The guests ask about her at the meal. Where is she? She's in the tent. And the Lord reiterates this promise that he had made to Abraham in 17:21. He says, I will return about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And listening within the tent, she laughs to herself. After I'm worn out, the way of women had ceased to be with her. Let the listener understand. And my Lord is old. He's pushing 100 at this point. She's 90. And she's wondering, am I really going to have a child? I don't think there's something radically different about her responsive laughter in Genesis 18 and his responsive laughter in Genesis 17. They are, in their minds, old. As a 35-year-old with a baby at home, I get it. 100 years or 90 is probably just too old to have a baby. But not according to the Lord. At least as it concerns Abraham and Sarah and God's redemptive work in the world. And again, as we said last week, it is not as though we're meant to see Abraham and Sarah in these chapters as being without faith, being conquered by unbelief, but they are real people, and incredulity is threatening to sneak in. And so the Lord asks, he knows what she says, despite the secrecy of it, and he asks, why did she laugh? And he says, is there anything too hard or too wonderful for the Lord? In a year, she will have a son. And so she interjects, I didn't laugh. And he says, no, but you did. The Lord is gentle to the small faith of Abraham and Sarah. And they both receive something of a gentle rebuke. Abraham's laughter in 17:17, the Lord tells him that the son's name shall be Isaac, meaning he laughs. And the Lord, in light of her lying to him about it, he gently but directly confronts Sarah about her laughter. And then the conversation ends. And so we're challenged and we're invited here through this question, is anything too hard or too wonderful for the Lord? The answer is obviously no. And so do you believe God when he speaks his word? Are you a doubter? Consider a few promises of God. Luke 12:32, fear not, little flock. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. John 6:40, for this is the will of my Father, that everyone who looks on the Son and believes in him should have eternal life. And I, that is the Son, will raise him up on the last day. Romans 8:38 and 39, for I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. 1 Thessalonians 4:3, for this is the will of God, your sanctification. 2 Corinthians 4:16, so we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Brothers and sisters, all the promises of God are yes and amen in Jesus Christ. Do we believe them? What we see in the last section here in verses 22 through 33, we see that God's friends wrestle with him in prayer. We're challenged by Abraham's bold intercession for Sodom as he wrestles with God here at the end of this chapter. The men set out from dinner and they look down toward Sodom. Abraham goes with them for a spell and he's intent to send them on their way. And then the Lord deliberates, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? He concludes that because he chose him and he covenanted with him, that he would share with him. I noted last week how these verses help us to understand the fuller requirement of the Abrahamic covenant, the circumcision obligation there. Abraham's physical offspring had to be circumcised, righteous, and just in order for God's blessing to come to fruition. And thank the Lord, his offspring, Jesus, was. But consider just how astounding it is that God treats Abraham as a confidant here. Is there any clearer demonstration of friendship? Last week we mentioned that the covenant of circumcision establishes Abraham as the head of a new creation. The Lord in Genesis 1 deliberates over the creation of man. They're not so much by way of questions, but statements of declaration. But we see a fitting echo of it here, especially with Psalm 8 in mind. David explores the value that God places on humankind there. He made them. He made us to be vice-regents over the whole earth. And so we see here in Genesis 18 the Lord revealing his plans to the new Noah, to the new Adam. And apparently already knowing what was going on in Sodom. And again, Abraham knew, the Lord knew, but it's a formal inquiry, you could call it. But likely knowing the situation, Abraham knows it's not going to go well. And so taking the hint that God is drawing him into his confidence, Abraham begins to ask his friend a series of bold questions. I read an article this week that highlights 4 things about Abraham's conversations with the Lord that we ought to emulate in our prayer lives. They're not original to me, but I think they're really helpful, and we'll share them pretty quickly and then wrap up and be done. First, Abraham's prayer here is specific. He doesn't ask God about a few people or several people or many people. He gives specific numbers. Lord, what if there's 50 people? Okay, 45, 40, all the way down to 10. So he prays a specific prayer. He wants the city to be saved for the sake of a specific number of people. But his prayer is also compassionate. Right? Abraham might have just prayed about Lot. Hey, Lord, Lot, my nephew, is down there, and I would really appreciate it if you gave me some time to get him out before you destroyed the city of wicked heathens down there. And while Abraham is surely most interested in Lot, he doesn't just pray for Lot. He prays for the entire city. Will you not spare the city for the sake of 50, even for the sake of 10? He seeks the welfare of the city rather than just his nephews. And so he prays a specific prayer. He prays a compassionate prayer, but he's also persistent in his prayer. As I read this week, Abraham refuses to take yes for an answer. He wants the yes to be as strong a yes as possible. He starts with a relatively high number. What about for the sake of 50? How about a few less? How about a few less than that? What about even just 10 people? Jesus commends this kind of consistent praying in Luke 11 and Luke 18. Luke 11, ask, seek, knock. Go to your neighbor's house, and even if he doesn't have any interest in helping you, if you keep knocking at his door, eventually he will. The persistent widow, pray to the judge for justice and ask him over and over and over again, and eventually you just might get it. And he concludes the whole point of those illustrations that if evil men will give to their children and to their neighbors and to local widows provisions and justice, just for the sake of persistence, how much more will God give to his children for the sake of theirs? And so Abraham is persistent. But he's also bold and reverent, for a final point here on his prayer. The first question definitely shocks us, doesn't it? Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put to death the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And yet, as Abraham continues to reduce his number, his heart shines through more and more. I am dust and ashes, Lord. Don't be angry, and I will speak again. And so what about us? What thing in our lives, what thing in your life is of particular concern at this moment? What thing is troubling you that weighs heavily on your heart? Are you willing to bring your request to God with specificity? Are you willing to bring it to God with a heart of compassion and to bring it to Him over and over and over again, boldly and yet remembering your station? Modeling our prayers after Abraham here and other saints in the Old Testament, it might feel scary and difficult, but it is something that we ought to do. And so, this text, wrapping it all up here, this text sets forth for us these challenges. God's friends are hospitable. They strive to have rightly ordered homes. And even in moments of weakness, we seek to trust the promises of God, and we diligently labor in wrestling with Him in prayer. But what does this teach us about God? Well, among other things, God invites sinners into friendship with Him. Matthew Henry writes this. He says, the importunity or the persistence with which believers use in their address to God is such that if they were dealing with a man like themselves, they could not but fear that He would be angry with them. But He with whom we have to do is God and not man. And however He may seem, He is not really angry with the prayers of the upright, for they are His delight, and He is pleased when He is wrestled with. Perhaps to our great surprise, the Lord receives Abraham's hospitality. I prayed at the beginning of the sermon from Isaiah 57:15 that God inhabits eternity, but He makes His dwelling with the lowly. Isn't that shocking? That Abraham could entertain the Lord and provide a meal that they enjoyed together. He comes and he dines with Abraham, but neither does he doesn't pass by, and even when he's there, he doesn't scold or chide the unbelief of Sarah unduly and unmercifully. He doesn't grow weary at Abraham's persistence. He doesn't become offended at his boldness. He draws near and he answers back with mercy. He says, for the sake of 50, I will not destroy it. Neither will I destroy it for the sake of 45 or 40 or 30 or 20 or even 10. And as we'll see next week, to spare these cities for the sake of 10 people, if 10 people could be found, 10 righteous people could be found, that is astonishingly merciful. And so, the Lord is strong and just. He is merciful and He is patient. And I pray that this text, that this passage would encourage our hearts to go to Him, trusting in Him, knowing that He He cares for us, and He's invited us into His friendship.